Welcome back to another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp, where my job is to help train Sabbath School teachers and front row students to get the most out of their class. Today, we are going to be looking at lesson number 12. We're almost done of the Adult Bible Study Guide. It's called Esther and Mordecai. So go ahead and grab your Bibles and your study guide because Sabbath School Boot Camp starts now. All right, welcome back to class. Like I said, we're going to be looking at the story of Esther, who is an example of, the lesson says, one of the most inspiring accounts of cross-cultural ministry. Yeah, I too aspire to a ministry and a culture where I have to hide who I am, lest the government finds out, decides to commit genocide on my entire people. Okay. All right, I'm being a little facetious here. There's actually a ton of really interesting conversations to have around the book of Esther, and I'm going to bring up a few of them as we go. So let's get on with the show. On Sunday, we're going to try to put ourselves into Esther's sandals, size 4, I believe. Hold on, that doesn't sound quite right. Anyways, let's try that again. We're going to try and understand what it must be like to live captive in a foreign culture, which is how the Jews, like Esther and Mordecai, ended up in the Persian capital. Now, the lesson points out that none of us live in an Adventist country. There are no Adventist countries where the culture and laws are favorable to our faith. In contrast, the Jews had to leave their Jewish country, go into exile. So, it's something we're going to find hard to relate to, which is true. But there are Adventist cultural bubbles where the mail is delivered on Sunday rather than Saturday and where it's as convenient as it possibly could be to keep the Sabbath. So, Adventists might be able to relate in some way to living in that bubble, then leaving the bubble and entering an environment which is hostile or indifferent to their faith. But nevertheless, Esther probably couldn't relate to what the lesson is saying either, as she was, in all likelihood, born in captivity, right? And the point the lesson is trying to make is that faithfulness is not a matter of convenience, but determination. We have to choose to be faithful wherever it is that we are, whether it's a friendly culture or hostile one, whether practicing our faith is convenient or not. Okay, message received. The lesson also points us to Daniel and the struggles he went through in Babylon. And even at the highest levels of the empire, Daniel's faithfulness is both profound and simple. His first test was a matter of staying true to his diet. His second test was solved by going to God in prayer and asking for the meaning of a dream. Daniel didn't really do anything extraordinary. He didn't raise the dead or solve complex problems. He did what he always did, albeit under great pressure. Faithfulness is not complicated, but it does take courage. It takes courage to stand by your convictions. And we all need those convictions to be tested. We do. Every time I've been in a situation where my convictions were tested and I held my ground, I felt like I've grown a foot taller spiritually in the aftermath. Our world is constantly asking us to give ground, an inch here, a foot there, and every once in a while you just have to say no. Your faith, my faith, it needs to be tested by adversity if it's going to be worth something. Anyways, the point of this day is that we should try and understand what it must be like to be a Jew in exile, like Daniel and Esther and Mordecai, and what it must be like to remain faithful there. Why did some people not return home from captivity? Is it because they were comfortable in their captivity? And there's a real danger for you and I that we might become comfortable in our captivity and prefer to live here and now rather than the free country that God has promised us. So long as we are not free to be with God where He is, we're all captives. On to Monday, as you probably know, the king of Persia threw a feast. His nobles demanded that Queen Vashti make an appearance, and she refused to make an appearance. We don't know why she refused to make an appearance. So let's be careful speculating. But the nobles were horrified that she refused to show up because if this gets out, they said women everywhere will start ignoring their husbands. The king was furious and banished her, and fragile masculinity won the day. And to this day, Vashti is a feminist hero in ancient history. Esther is a story about women in a man's world as much as it is about Jewish exiles. After the king calms down, he remembers, I no longer have a queen. I need a new queen. So he sets out to find the new queen in Esther chapter 2. The plan was simple, a search for the most beautiful women who would then be brought into the harem, given beauty treatments, and the one who pleases the king the most will be queen. Super simple plan. It was completely unconcerned about female agency. A woman will be found and crowned based purely on what the king wants. It's as if this whole process is designed to make sure the king doesn't get another Vashti, another headstrong, independent woman who, at least in that situation, can decide if she wants to show up or not. Esther is presented as the opposite of Vashti. She's good and obedient. Verse 8 tells us that she was taken. Verse 9 tells us that the eunuch in charge of Esther moved her to the best place in the harem. Even though Esther is liked, it's as if Esther has no say in the matter. Things are just happening to her. Now, the wrinkle in all of this is Mordecai, Esther's cousin, who also adopted her, so yeah. Anyways, he warned her not to reveal that she is a Jew, because the secret to prosperity in exile was not to draw attention to yourself as an exile. As the story goes on, it's clear why Mordecai felt this way, because there were people in Persia who hated foreigners, apparently, especially Jews. How little has changed in thousands of years. But, well, concealing your religious identity seems so scandalous to some people in the West today. It's completely understandable to many Christians in other countries as well as missionaries in those countries, because, well, not long ago I was doing research and was told there are certain historical documents we don't publish about because it may endanger Adventists living in those countries. Maybe it's an old letter where an Adventist missionary criticizes the political rulers, and you and I might look at that and say, oh, cool, let's talk about that on Facebook. But it might get those believers in that country in trouble if their government finds out about it. Does this mean we're hiding our faith? No, we're just being wise. You can live a life of obedience to God without broadcasting it to everyone. Though, of course, we wish everyone had the liberty to live out their convictions as publicly as they wish. Tuesday takes a break on Esther's story and focuses on Mordecai in Esther 3. Why is there a break? Because, well, probably this is the time King Ahasuerus is going to fight the Greeks at Thermopylae. This is Sparta! This is why the women are given beauty treatments, I think, for 12 months before they meet the king, because he's gone. In Esther chapter 3, we learn that Haman the Agagite was promoted, and everyone bowed out of respect, maybe more, for Haman's new promotion. But Mordecai refused. Why? Well, because Haman, it seems, was a descendant of the Amalekites, a people God told King Saul to destroy, and which Saul had failed to do. Haman, it seems, knew Mordecai was a Jew, so it's not surprising at all if Haman had it out for the Jews. There's a deep tribal history being played out in a foreign land. Nevertheless, it leaves us with the question, should Mordecai have bowed down? I mean, we might tell him, hey, look, you respect the office, not the man. Bowing down is really just about respecting the king who appointed Haman, not Haman himself. Mordecai's colleagues probably said all of this, what are you doing, dude? Just bow down, right? But Esther 3:4 tells us that Mordecai explained why he couldn't bow down, because he revealed to them that he was a Jew, exactly the opposite of what Mordecai had advised Esther. Now, Mordecai is a puzzling figure. The fact that Haman was a descendant of an Amalekite king seems only to have mattered to Mordecai, because Haman, the Bible tells us, it seems, only came to hate the Jews because he learned Mordecai was a Jew. So, in a very real sense, the only reason why the Jews need Esther to deliver them was because Mordecai refused to show deference to Haman. Haman doesn't seem to have dwelled on his ancestors' ancient rivalry with Israel. It was only that this guy Mordecai is both a Jew and a jerk, and he disrespects me. So, look, that's not to excuse the fact that Haman went from this guy hurt my feelings to I must commit genocide alarmingly fast. Something is definitely wrong with Haman, but it is fair to wonder if we ever would have had the Esther story at all if Mordecai would have just shown him the respect which his position demanded. Now, the lesson is entitled Mordecai's Faithful Witness, but witness to what? Was his stand a refusal to acknowledge Haman because of some ancient rivalry? Solomon, after all, had no problem marrying Pharaoh's daughter, despite the fact that the Egyptians had enslaved the Israelites. Elijah healed Naaman, even though Naaman's people had been attacking the Israelites. They had no grudge. There are plenty of Israelites who didn't dwell on this ancient history and just moved on. Besides, why are Mordecai and Esther still in the Persian Empire? Why didn't they go home to Israel? Now, the ancient rabbis have asked these same questions. We're not the first to wonder about them. And some think that this command to bow down and pay homage to Haman is a phrase that's only ever used of God elsewhere. That is, that Haman was presenting himself as a god. And in the Greek version of Esther, which adds a little bit more to the book, Mordecai explains that he bows only to God. So it seems in the Greek version, this is how Mordecai saw it. Other commentators have said that Mordecai knew what Haman was like and conscientiously felt he couldn't work under Haman's administration, so he conscientiously refuses to accept his authority, and unfortunately that also means the king who appointed Haman. Now, the book of Esther is entirely unconcerned with why Mordecai refused to bow, as the book of Daniel is entirely unconcerned with why Daniel refused to eat the king's food. I'm glad we don't know more about Mordecai's reasons for not bowing, because look, sometimes we're convicted to take a stand on something that we maybe otherwise cannot justify, except to say, God told me to hold my ground on this, and hey, look, that should be enough. But Haman goes and tells the king that all Jews are bad people and are enemies of the state, and he secures a law that all Jews, women, and children should be killed. Great. Let's move on to Wednesday and look at how Esther got Mordecai out of this predicament. Now, Mordecai asks Esther to appeal to the king, and Esther responds, hey, I'm risking my life here. Did you hear what happened to the last queen? Right? No one can come before the king unless invited. And, well, as Vashti learned, no one can refuse to come before the king if invited. Mordecai, who, again, really started all of this by telling Esther to not say that she's a Jew while he's telling people that he's a Jew, and by ticking Haman off by refusing the bow, he now thinks his cousin, he tells her, don't think that you can save yourself. Just because you think nobody knows that you're a Jew. Now, there's a way of reading Esther where Mordecai is a wise prophetic figure, and there's a way of reading Esther where Mordecai is a real jerk. Okay, after risking his life by defying Haman, he's now risking her life too, right? But the book of Esther, again, is entirely unconcerned over whether Mordecai was right or wrong. I think we just have to assume that either God was telling Mordecai to take a stand by not bowing to Haman, or else there was some sort of maybe worship involved that Mordecai could not participate in. Anyways, as a result, Mordecai had to reveal that he was a Jew, and as he feared, that put a target on the entire Jewish people. In the world of the book of Esther, it's striking how dangerous it is to simply be known as a Jew. The book is focused on two individuals, two protagonists, Esther and Mordecai, but it's also about a third protagonist, the Jewish people as a whole. There are people who are in no less danger than Esther or Mordecai. One individual Jew's mistake can lead to genocide. And that's a really, really tense situation to live in. And just as one Jew can get his entire people into trouble, only one Jew can get them out of trouble. In that sense, this whole story, in Mordecai in particular, is a type of Adam. And Esther is a type of Christ. Like Christ, she hardly hesitates to risk her own life for her people, but we cannot see Esther as the singular savior before she solicits the prayers of the entire Jewish community. Esther is the individual who dares to go before the king, but through their prayers, every Jew in Susa was right there with her. On to Thursday. The king receives Esther, thankfully, and then there are a bunch of feasts, which the lesson doesn't get into, and Esther denounces Haman for his schemes. And in the crucial center of the book, chapters 6 and 7, we see Haman hanged and Mordecai exalted. Justice is served, and in these two men are the histories of their people. Israel is finally faithful to destroy the Amalekites, which they failed to do so long ago. Even in exile, they find honor among the nations. The fame of their God spreads, and even if God is never explicitly mentioned in Esther, he's there. Esther is setting things right that had gone wrong. It is finding meaning and power in apparent defeat. It is about the danger of being Jewish and how the Jewish people will survive by standing together. In other words, it is not really about Esther. Isn't that the cruel irony of the book? It's really about Mordecai and his great controversy with Haman and the Jewish people as a whole, right? Their great controversy with other nations. Now, whether Esther does come in, where she comes in again, is at the very end, where she and Mordecai issue a joint decree that the Jews commemorate the event, and it's called Purim, which is a Persian name meaning lots. Haman had cast lots to decide on what date the Jews were to be destroyed. So Purim is quintessentially a modern Jewish feast because, as the old saying goes, all Jewish feasts are basically, they tried to kill us, God saved us, let's eat. Okay, Friday. There are so many questions about the book of Esther. As usual, we glossed over whether or not Esther had sex with the king as part of her audition to be the next queen. I would say she almost certainly did, though the author of the book treats the subject very delicately. But that begs another question: why does it matter to us if she had sex with the king? The argument could be made that this was a textbook power rape. I mean, she was taken into the harem, she had no choice, and she was taken to the king. Esther, in that sense, was just a victim, like all of those other women that were a part of this process. But she isn't just a victim. She had to want to become queen in some way, right? That part wasn't forced upon her. This topic of sex in Esther is really complicated, and I'm sure you are not going to get into it. There's also the question of women in the book of Esther. Vashti refuses to be summoned to the king's party, but Esther basically summons herself to the king. Both women risked their lives, but only one woman was rewarded for it. It's really complicated being a woman, I would imagine. How are women to behave in this man's world? And there's no obvious answer in Esther. Whether you come to the king or don't come to the king, you're in danger at all times. Sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't. Neither woman plays the role that is expected of them. But at the end of the day, the book is a good reminder that while God's presence is not always obvious in a situation, he's always around working things out. Esther and Mordecai show us a blend of being careful and wise. Don't announce that you're a Jew and thus provoke hostility. Be smart. But when things go sideways, be fearless and selfless. Now, the first challenge on Thursday is to pray for the courage to share something God has done for us with someone on our prayer list. The second challenge is to begin journaling the things that God has done for you. All right, that's going to do it for us this week. Thanks so much for joining us for Sabbath School Boot Camp. I'll see you next week. Class dismissed.